Well, you don't. With most investigative projects, a lot of time and thought goes into, planning the reporting, making sure that you can get the story, making sure the documents will be there, and then, as you go along, planning a publication date, a writing schedule, all the multimedia that needs to be done. This story was far different. We pursued it for 5 months in secret, but once we started to publish, it became a very competitive story with news organizations all around the United States trying to catch up on the story. So we were very pressed to keep the lead on the story and get documents and publish documents in the paper. So most of those 600 stories that we did in the 1 year were done on deadline. There was not the 2 or 3 or 4 days to get ready for it. We had to write, many days we wrote 5,000 and 6,000 words in 3 or 4 hours time to meet daily deadlines. So it was quite unlike your normal investigative project once the subject became known to everybody. It was difficult because many of the victims didn't want to talk about what had happened to them. Some of them were willing to talk to us, but they weren't willing to give us the details, and we needed to know what had actually happened. And those were difficult questions. But we're reporters. Our job is to get people to tell us. And what we said to people is that this is a horrible cover-up that has gone on for too long. And if you are willing to talk to us, if you are willing to help us, we can stop it. We can stop priests from abusing children. And that argument was very persuasive with many people because they didn't want what had happened to them to happen to other children. And so many were willing to speak. Many of them wanted us to even use their names and tell their stories. And by telling their stories, there were many things that changed in the church. And so people often say, well, what happened? And I say, well, sometimes I think most about what didn't happen. Because the victims were so courageous and willing to talk, there were thousands of children, I think, who were not abused. I don't think so. I think both in the US and anywhere overseas, it's very difficult for news organizations to take on powerful institutions. In many countries, the powerful institutions control the freedom of the reporters. And if the reporters ask tough questions, they can go to jail. In the United States, all too often the most powerful institutions don't get the same kind of scrutiny as other institutions should. Sometimes, very often, you'll find that the publishers of newspapers sit on the boards of directors of the most important institutions in the community. And it's difficult, I think, for the editors to assign reporters to do tough stories on those institutions. So we still face this problem. It takes gutsy editors and reporters to get at these stories. Well, we learned several things. I think most importantly, we learned that news organizations, investigative reporters, have to give the same scrutiny to the most iconic institutions in our society as we give to government agencies and politicians. We can't assume that agencies that do so much public good, like the Catholic Church, like museums, for instance, we can't assume that the people who run them are godlike creatures. We have to assume that they're fallible human beings. So that's the most important lesson we learned, that the Catholic Church really got away with this for a very long time all over the world because nobody could imagine that they could be responsible for this. The other thing we learned is to look for stories in different places, that we often investigated things that whistleblowers told us about, corruption in government. And it's important to do that. But what we learned from the church story is there are many, many more important stories about victimized populations that you don't need a whistleblower to tell you about. You could just walk out the door and look around you and you find those stories. You find people who have no one to turn to but us, that we're the only ones who can bring them justice. We're the only ones who can end the injustice. We're the only ones who can call attention to these kinds of problems to the people who read us and who depend upon us to do this kind of reporting.